Hey friends, Ash here with Gents. Today I'm going to be reviewing a Parfums Vintage Pineapple Vintage fragrance, and it's their new flanker of Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold. In this video, I'm going to go over Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold and compare it to Pineapple Vintage Intense. In case you're unaware, both of these fragrances are basically one of Parfums Vintage's takes on Creed Aventus, of which they have many. There's a lot to talk about here, a lot to break down, so let's just jump into it right away. Before I go any further, I need to let you guys know that this was sent to me many months ago. So Pineapple Vintage, Parfums Vintage, they did send me this fragrance. And also, I'm gonna be giving this fragrance away at the end of the video. Just this one right here. I'll pack it up and send it on to you. So stay tuned for information on that giveaway. First off, let's quickly check out the presentation. That way we can start breaking this one down. Here you've got the box. This is your standard Pineapple Vintage box. You've got the name of the fragrance right here on the front. Then you've got the Pineapple Vintage logo on top of the box here. Then on one side you have ingredients. On the other side of the box, you have a caution. On the back of the box, you have that little photo that you'll find on the back of all the Pineapple Vintage boxes. And there's a quick look at the bottom of the box with a quality control pass sticker. If you've seen a Pineapple Vintage or a Parfums Vintage bottle before, you already know how they look, but we'll take a quick look at it anyway. Here's a quick look at the front of the bottle as this wooden cap, which slides snugly into place. And on the bottom is where you'll actually find the name of the fragrance. The atomizer on this one is pretty good. I will waste a spray for you. There we go. Like I said at the beginning of the video, Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold is essentially a flanker to Pineapple Vintage Intense, which was essentially a flanker to the original Pineapple Vintage or Pineapple Vintage Classic. As I understand it, the thought process behind Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold is that they've increased the musk, they've increased the pineapple, and they've tried to formulate this so that you won't go anosmic or nose blind as easily to Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold as you will Pineapple Vintage Intense, because a lot of people with Pineapple Vintage Intense had sprayed this on and then gone, oh, I can't smell it. It must not be there anymore. This is terrible in terms of performance. When in reality, they had just gone nose blind and it was still there. So that was the thought process behind this one, Intense Gold. Like I said, there are a lot of things to unpack here. Some things about this fragrance that I think are good. Other things about this fragrance that I don't like. I guess we'll just start with a breakdown of the fragrance and compare it to Pineapple Vintage Intense, since this one is supposed to be an improvement on Pineapple Vintage Intense. Intense Gold is very similar to Intense. In my opinion, if you already own Pineapple Vintage Intense, you will probably find it redundant to own Intense Gold. They both have a fresh, bright, fruity opening that really emphasizes the pineapple note in the fragrances. There's also apple and bergamot in there. In Intense Gold, it maybe comes across slightly fresher, just very slightly brighter, but the difference is not enormous. Is there a little bit more pineapple noticeable in the opening of Intense Gold? Yeah, very slightly. But if I'm being honest, if you're not a fragrance fanatic, if you're not a hardcore collector, and if you're not smelling them side by side, you would probably just think, yeah, that's Pineapple Vintage Intense. Assuming you know what Pineapple Vintage Intense is. There's not a huge difference between the two of these. I'll also say that the opening of Pineapple Vintage Intense seems to linger a little bit longer than Intense Gold. With Intense Gold, it starts to sag into the mid where you pick up these very slight floral nuances on the edge of the fragrance underneath the fruity notes. You pick that up earlier on in Intense Gold than you do Intense. And as it dries down, Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold still smells very similar to Pineapple Vintage Intense. I had my wife smell them side by side and she thought that they were like 95% similar, almost the exact same. In the far Drydown, to me, Pineapple Vintage Intense comes across a little bit sweeter, just barely. Like you can pick up the vanilla very slightly more in Pineapple Vintage Intense. In Intense Gold, it comes across a little more sparkly, effervescent, you might call it, because of the musk and ambroxan. Or they call it an ambergris note officially, but it's coming across like ambroxan. There's a little more of that in Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold. So into the Drydown, that one, Intense Gold, comes across again a little bit brisker, a little bit fresher, but is the difference huge? No, it really isn't. And if you're smelling these side by side, spraying them on at the exact same time and smelling them at the exact same time as they dry down, that's really about the only way you're gonna be able to tell the difference between the two. Maybe those slight nuances, that 5% difference that I mentioned before between these two fragrances is enough of a reason for you to want to pick this up. That slight added emphasis on additional pineapple in the opening, the slight additional emphasis on the musk as it dries down, and what smells like additional ambroxan, maybe that would make you want Intense Gold over Intense. But again, if you already own Intense, I don't really think there's a reason to own Intense Gold. I think it's redundant. Also, between these two fragrances, Vintage Intense comes across like it has a little bit more birch than Intense Gold does. Now, neither one of these is heavy on birch, even though Vintage Intense might come across like it has a little bit more in there. It's still not birch heavy. This is not one of those Aventus style fragrances that goes for a smoky feel. This is more centered on those fruity notes and the musks, the ambergris slash ambroxan with a little bit of vanilla. Like I said before, these two fragrances are very similar. So if you own both of them, there's going to be an enormous amount of overlap between these two fragrances. Now, if you don't own Vintage Intense and Vintage Intense Gold sounds more interesting to you, maybe that would be the one to check out and just forego the original Intense. I think for me personally, the best Aventus style fragrance that Parfums Vintage makes is going to be Emperor or Emperor Extrait, and Pineapple Vintage Intense after that. My wife's favorite is Pineapple Vintage Intense, and she absolutely loves Pineapple Vintage Intense, and for that matter, she loves Intense Gold because they're very similar. In terms of projection and longevity, Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold is in the 7 to 8 hour range. Projection is right around average, slightly above average. It projects well, but not monstrously. I would say though, in the opening, when the pineapple, apple, bergamot, those notes are really popping off your skin, it projects pretty heavily at that point, but those settle down pretty quickly. And once they start to settle down as it heads into the mid, it becomes moderate. Now let's talk about a few things that pop up with Parfums Vintage, some issues. One issue that happened earlier this year, I believe you can see on Fragrantica, people writing about it, is Pineapple Vintage Intense had an issue where it came across smelling skanky, essentially. The opening, instead of it coming across this really pleasant, fresh, fruity, sweet opening, came across skanky. Some people were saying fecal, just not great. Apparently, some of the batches of Pineapple Vintage Intense that were made had that issue. And according to what people have written, if you refrigerate your bottle for a couple of days after getting it in, it made that note go away. Now, I'm not a chemist, so I'm not sure why that would be, but that was an issue. I'm not sure if that carried over at all into Intense Gold. I haven't heard that, but just be aware of that. If for some reason you get in a sample or a bottle or something like that and it has a weird tone to it, you may want to pop it in your fridge. One other thing that comes up is the price on these Pineapple Vintage releases. When Pineapple Vintage Intense was first released, which was back in May 2017, I believe, it went for $85 for a 100 ml size bottle, this size right here. Today, that same fragrance in a 50 ml size bottle, like this one, 50 mils, goes for $79. A 100 ml bottle nowadays, 129 bucks. So in 2.5 years, it's gone from $85 to $130. Intense Gold, this one goes for $89 for 50 ml size, or $149 for 100 ml size. So essentially, from when this was released 2.5 years ago, where it was 85 bucks, their new Vintage Intense Gold, the new flanker to that fragrance, cost you $5 more for half the size. So the prices have been steadily increasing over the past 2.5 years. It's just slowly creeping up more and more and more and more and more, until it's gotten to the point now that if you want 100 milliliters of one of these fragrances, it's gonna run you 150 bucks. And at that point, we're talking niche prices at discounters, or assuming you buy your niche fragrances from discounters, I should say. So for a lot of people out there, that's going to price these fragrances out of their price range for what they're comfortable paying for an Aventus style fragrance, which I completely understand. That's very expensive. When I first made a review on Pineapple Vintage back 3 years ago, maybe, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe it was $75 for Pineapple Vintage Classic and Pineapple Vintage Noir for 100 ml size bottle. And at the time, I said $75 for a clone style fragrance is overpriced. Now jump forward a few years and a lot of their fragrances are going for double that. Obviously guys, I'm not a professional perfumer, so I can't sit here and tell you guys that ingredients have not increased. I can't sit here and tell you that because I'm not for sure. I've purchased naturals from Eden Botanicals. I've purchased synthetics from Perfumer's Supply House, from Perfumer's Apprentice, and dabbled around with making fragrances, but I'm no good at it. From the little bit that I've paid attention when I was buying things online, I don't think that ingredients have jumped up that much. So overall, what do I think about Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold? I think it smells good. It's very pleasant. My wife likes it. It's a compliment getter. It's versatile, just like Aventus, just like Pineapple Vintage Intense. Do I think you need to own it? If you have Pineapple Vintage Intense or any of the other Pineapple Vintage releases, I don't really think so. It fills the exact same niche that this one did, Pineapple Vintage Intense. It makes a few tweaks here and there, but they're small. Do I go any more nose blind personally to Vintage Intense than I do Intense Gold? No, it's pretty much the exact same for me. Do I think it's an enormous improvement? No, like I said before, maybe 5% difference. And realistically, most people out there who are not into fragrances as a hardcore hobby will not be able to really tell these apart. If you do it blind, spray Intense on one hand, Intense Gold on the other, and go up to somebody and say, what do you think about this? Okay, what do you think about this? They'll probably just look at you and say, it smells the same. So there we go. If you like Vintage Intense, you should like Vintage Intense Gold. Okay, for the giveaway for Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold, all you have to do is like the video, comment on the video that you want to be entered in the giveaway, and be subscribed to the channel. And I guess to be entered in the giveaway, in your comment, leave whichever fragrance you'd like to receive for Christmas this year. Can be anything, designer, discontinued, niche, indie, doesn't matter. But you have to put that in there in order to be entered. And after 1 week, I'll do a random comment picker, and whoever wins, I will put that comment in the community tab of my YouTube page like I do with all the giveaways. All you have to do is reach out to me at that point if you're the winner, and I will ship this right to you. So good luck, everybody. This bottle of Pineapple Vintage Intense Gold could be yours. If you've smelled those fragrances, let me know below in the comments what you think about them. As always, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for all your support, and I'll see you again tomorrow with another fragrance video. Cheers. No, that's not alcohol.